I and my predecessor had instances where people had even appeared in the media saying they'd written letters to the chairman of the 1922 committee when they hadn't. I've even had an instance in the previous parliament when a colleague had said that he'd written to me, then appeared in the media saying he'd withdrawn the letter, when in fact he'd never written in the first place. So it is impossible, I think, for anybody to know exactly what the state of play is, apart from the chairman of the 1922.
It's time for lifting the lid then. Ever wonder how something works, why it does happen or why it doesn't? Who's pulling the strings? What goes on under the bonnet? Well, on this show, Lifting the Lid, in association with the Yesterday Channel, we try to find out something we might not know a lot about, but it's been talked a lot about in the news. And if there's one thing we've heard a lot about this week, it's the 1922 committee. Letters and votes and committee rule changes and all that. But what is it? Who is on it? Why is it called the 1922 committee? Is it 100 years old? Well, we can put all those questions now to the chairman of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady. Morning, Graham.
Hello, Matt.
Nice to have you with us. Now, let's get the first thing out of the way first of all. The 1922 committee isn't 100 years old this year, is it?
You're absolutely right. It'll be our centenary next year. And the reason for the name of the committee, it was the Conservative MPs elected first in the general election of 1922, who, when they've been in the House for a few months, were trying to find a way of being more effective, finding out what was going on in the House of Commons, and they decided they'd get together once a week for a meeting together. I think human nature being what it is, fairly soon everybody else wanted to know what was going on inside the closed doors of the committee room where they were meeting, and said, well, can we come along as well? So it became the whole backbench of the Conservative Party. And the other crucial thing, I think, that happened right at the beginning, when they went to see the Chief Whip to say they were going to set up this new committee that would meet every week, the Chief Whip was a very smart man who, instead of seeing this as an incipient threat of some sort, he decided it was going to be an asset to have all these new boys, I guess they're all new boys, not new girls in those days, in one place at the same time in every week. And he made a very brilliant offer. He said, well, that's wonderful. Would it help if I sent one of my whips to your meeting to tell you what the forthcoming business of the House will be? So ever since the first meetings of the 1922 committee, there's been a government whip or an opposition whip or an opposition present, which is one of the things, I think, which has ensured that the 1922 committee has been an open channel of communication between the front bench and the back benches, which really is our core function.
Now, maybe I'm just too cynical, Graham, but that I mean, it's very helpful coming in with the government business of the week. It does also give an opportunity for that whip to possibly spy on what backbench MPs are saying.
It does, and some of my colleagues managed to circumvent that problem by leaking what goes on in the room themselves, as you know, which is unfortunate. I think in some ways the executive of the 1922 committee, the 18-member elected executive, often those meetings are far more significant, and they are more private. They allow a much deeper discussion of quite sensitive issues, and almost never leaks at all.
So explain then the difference. Who is on the executive? You're obviously the chairman. How do you get that job, and who else is on the sort of the team around you?
Well, it's elected, but and all of the officers and the other executive members are elected by colleagues. So we have a chairman, two vice chairmen who are William Ragg and Naz Garney at the moment. We have treasurer Geoffrey Clifton Brown, the two secretaries, Bob Blackman and Gary Sambrook, and then 12 other executive members. And I've served on the executive a number of different times during my now shockingly 25 years in Parliament. And I find that it has almost always been a pretty broad representation of the spectrum of opinion in the parliamentary party. And I just think it's something that my colleagues tend to get right, rather than ending up with just one strand of opinion in the party represented on the executive. It is a genuinely representative body.
Now, for large periods, I mean, you mentioned you've been there for 25 years. I've been in Parliament for 17 years covering the goings-on. For long periods, the goings-on of the 1922 committee were very much your business. Didn't necessarily rock the boat particularly. But your profile's been through the roof, not just this week, but a couple of years ago as well with Theresa May. Presumably you'd prefer a quieter life, but it's this particular rule, the constant obsession with your letterbox and how many letters you've got. Just explain this process. So it's 15% of Conservative MPs need to write to you as chairman to say you don't have confidence in the Prime Minister, and if you get that 15%, there is a vote. Just talk me through the mechanics. Are they? Because I've read at various points, they could be letters, they could even be emails or WhatsApps. What is the actual mechanism?
Well, yes, it's normally a very small part of what we do, but it is probably inevitably the highest profile thing that goes on, and clearly when the party's in government especially, it does decide the fate of prime ministers. So it's natural that there is a very intense interest. The process really depends very much on complete confidentiality, because it seems to me that the idea that you would have these 15% of Conservative MPs, 54 as it is at the moment, writing to the chairman of the 1922 committee, and that I would give some kind of running commentary on how many colleagues have asked for a no confidence vote, simply wouldn't work. And if I did give that running commentary, it would be bound to influence the conduct and views of colleagues one way or another. It might either deter them from writing a letter, or it might encourage them, and I think that would be completely wrong. So it's a bit of a burden keeping quite a big secret, but I think it's very important that it does remain completely confidential. The downside of that, of course, is that colleagues don't know exactly when the threshold might be reached.
But if we were to be reading things in the past few weeks, things in the papers, things online, MPs, sources saying there's this number or there's that number in, or it's dangerously close, or they're a long way. Is it right to possibly view that as absolute nonsense and that nobody knows apart from you?
Almost invariably, it's nonsense. There are occasions when people have done pretty good surveys of what colleagues have said, or perhaps private conversations they've had with them, and have arrived at reasonable estimates of what the state of play might be at a given time. The difficulty, of course, is that depends on colleagues doing exactly what they say they've done. And as I've said before, I and my predecessor had instances where people had even appeared in the media saying they'd written letters to the chairman of the 1922 committee when they hadn't. I've even had an instance in the previous parliament when a colleague had said that he'd written to me, then appeared in the media saying he'd withdrawn the letter, when in fact he'd never written in the first place. So it is impossible, I think, for anybody to know exactly what the state of play is apart from the chairman of the 1922 committee.
So much excitement last week. Your letterbox was very busy over the Jubilee weekend. How many letters did you get in the end?
I don't reveal that, but yes, it was busy, but it was also complicated because I had some colleagues who said, I've decided to write a letter to you, but I've also quite determined that we don't mess up the Queen's Jubilee celebrations, and we don't start to intrude on the coverage of that. So I don't think it was accidental that the threshold was reached just at the point where the Jubilee celebrations were coming to an end.
So that was the case, that the sort of the post-dated, not to be open, like a sort of Christmas, not to be opened until Christmas Day, not to be opened until after the Jubilee, or not to be counted until after the Jubilee. That was the point at which the threshold was breached rather than before.
Yes.
And we've been hearing a lot about the possibility that you might look to change the rules. At the moment, there can't be another vote of confidence for 12 months. But there's talk of changing the rules. Is that something that you're looking at?
No. And it's not something that we as an executive discussed at all in this parliament. There was a point in the previous parliament when those discussions took place at length. We ended up without changing the rule. I'm just trying, obviously I've reflected quite a lot on this because of the amount of speculation that's been in the media. It's a little bit like saying, well, I haven't committed a crime of burglary because Parliament might possibly change the law in the future. Now, of course, it is technically possible that laws can be changed in the future, and it's possible that rules can be changed in the future. But I think it's important we say that the rule that is in place and is likely to remain in place is that there is a year's period of grace following a confidence vote.
So there's no mechanism now for removing the Prime Minister through your good offices. Even if, for instance, if you've got 180 letters, would you make that public if you knew that more than half of Conservative MPs wanted to remove the Prime Minister? Is that what you make public? Or is Boris Johnson just safe now in number 10 for 12 months?
I don't want to get too far into hypotheticals, but obviously there are conversations that I have with the Prime Minister and have had with his two predecessors, where I will try to convey the mood of the party and give as fair an assessment as I can of where colleagues' minds are. So, of course, I can have those conversations.
The men in grey suits could still always go and have a chat. Really good to speak to you. So Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee. Thanks very much for lifting the lid on Times Radio.